economy will have the same delivery of the national.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, sir, Prime Minister, honourable ministers, honourable members of Parliament. I wish you all a very happy sitting, and it's good to see that most of us are in good health, and for that we congratulate our healthcare people. Mr. Speaker, sir, may I first of all, I risk this comment to congratulate Nandronga for their win on Saturday. We have too many super supporters here, they may not like that comment, but we congratulate Nandronga their double-header match victory on Saturday.
Take the referee.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I don't have very good memories of playing in Nandronga. The last time I captained Suba, we took our boots off in Korlew when the match was aborted after a small scuffle on the field. Mr. Speaker, sir, yesterday at the communion service in Wesley City Mission Church, the Reverend Aquila Mbaki mentioned that this is Reconciliation Week. And part of his message was the reconciliation that took place when the brothers Jacob and Esau, as recorded in Genesis chapter 32, met after many years of separation triggered by the younger twin, Jacob, and their mother tricking their father, Isaac, into giving the younger brother the blessings he had intended to give the older brother. Today I shall try to contribute to this debate on the national budget of 2020 to 2021 as presented by the learned, the Honourable Attorney General and Minister for the Economy on the evening of Friday, the 17th of July, 2020, in a language and tone that will promote and encourage thoughts and feelings of reconciliation. Mr. Speaker, sir, I am no shadow Minister of the Economy, but I am here as a shadow Prime Minister. So my presentation will be at the level expected of the Prime Minister and the shadow Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, sir, this national budget is an extraordinary budget. We accept that. That was anticipated with a heightened degree of hope by the people of Fiji as thousands now look to government for help. These people and all of us here are victims of the economic downturn due to COVID-19 pandemic. There was and continues to be anxiety amongst the people as to how the 2020-21 budget would actually provide them relief and comfort from their current situation. In addition to the effects of COVID-19 pandemic, thousands of people have also been victims of the devastation caused by Tropical Cyclone Harold that the nation suffered in April of this year. What in the budget is designed to bring relief to the afflicted at this time? Before responding to the national budget, Mr. Speaker, sir, let me put on record and reiterate my sincere gratitude and congratulations to our frontline workers for their resolve, dedication, and unwavering commitment to contain the in-country spread of COVID-19 pandemic. The nurses, the paramedics, doctors, hospital administrators, security personnel, police force, the military personnel, and all those people associated with the pandemic control, trying their very best to contain and control, to control the spread of the pandemic, deserve mention for their enormous contribution. We, the people of Fiji, salute them for their giving their best to contain and control the spread of the pandemic, and deserve mention for your enormous contribution, your dedication, and your commitment. And I ask the Honourable Minister for Health to please convey defense, etc., also to convey our sentiments to those involved. I know we're not out of the woods yet, Mr. Speaker, and the claim that we are COVID contained perhaps is not true, unless you mean that COVID-19 has contained us within the confines of our borders. We do not exactly know where the world is heading right now, and the uncertainty continues as the cases of infection increases around the world. Thousands of people are dying on a daily basis, and the world has now seen more than 16 million cases reported and confirmed. The people of Fiji must unite and stand together in these trying times. Indeed, the whole world needs to stand together to fight the pandemic and come out of the predicament that we are in today. In view of this, Mr. Speaker, sir, I urge the Fiji First Government to consider and foster genuine discussion on this issue among political parties and communities to build trust and confidence to fight the current economic downturn. On many occasions in the past, Mr. Speaker, sir, I had called on the government for a bipartisan approach in addressing issues of national interest, but they have always fallen on deaf ears. Our suggestions have been brushed aside for perhaps political reasons. This side of the House has been demeaned, belittled several times, and we've grown punch drunk from being belittled. But we will continue. And sadly, the confrontational thinking continues, with reconciliation remaining but a dream. We also have many concerned citizens with appropriate understanding, and I mention a few. I hope they will forgive me, Mr. Beddoes, Mr. Narumbe, Professor Wadanase, who have from time to time written their opinions in the papers and who have also been dismissed without being heard. Mr. Speaker, sir, I was listening to the Honourable Minister for the Economy with great concern. In fact, I do not want to be in his seat at this time. He sounded serious with his words about how different this COVID-19 situation was in the history of mankind. Indeed, it is tragic, a tragic phase in human history, where millions of people are going through very difficult times. But, Mr. Speaker, sir, despite the great tragedy glaring in our eyes, straight into our eyes, every day and every moment, the Minister of the Economy, I believe, continues to believe everything is okay, sits high on his pedestal. He made me laugh when he bragged about himself and his achievements. And let me quote just a few lines. And I quote, "So, what have we accomplished? Through a world-leading testing and contact tracing campaign, we are a COVID-contained country. We are a COVID-contained country. Excluding a handful of cases confirmed among returning citizens who have been confined securely in government-funded quarantine facilities, Fiji is 90 days removed from our last reported case of the virus. Families in Fiji are safe, and our record on testing ranks ahead of the rest of the world, right alongside New Zealand and Australia," end of quote. I was wondering where the Honourable Minister lives, where we were speaking from. Was he on the same planet I'm on? You do not stop bragging about your achievements. So he does not stop bragging about what he says are his achievements or his government's achievements. Mr. Speaker, sir, I believe he was not very complimentary, in fact, condemning other countries that are so badly afflicted with the pandemic and where people are losing their lives and loved ones, and only praising our neighbors, Australia and New Zealand, perhaps in the hope that they will include us in their travel bubble for our tourism industry. Mr. Speaker, sir, the Honourable Minister of Economy must know that our health care is in complete shambles, and even in that state, they have managed to do very well at this time. The people of this country know this. The people who do not have the luxury of being treated at the super private hospital, commonly known as that, but quite correctly perceived to be that. And they see that it's only for the elite who can afford it. And the people know that well. Mr. Speaker, so had our country not been so isolated and insulated by the wide expanse of the Pacific Ocean, our predicament would have been worse. Our healthcare system is not at all in a position to handle such a pandemic situation. But as I said before, they have done well. They've done very well. We are grateful for the human sacrifice, the human factor of healthcare in Fiji. The fact of the matter, Mr. Speaker, sir, is that Fiji First government, Mr. Prime Minister, has hardly done enough for our healthcare system in the past 10 years. The people of this country know this. Mr. Speaker, sir, let me recall some more of the ministers bragging that some may have forgotten. These were uttered only over a year ago, and I quote, "This age of historic economic achievements, this unbroken decade, has been rightly dubbed by some as the Mbani Marama boom for our economy. Not a bump, nor a bubble, but an economic boom that has carried our economy through 10 years of expansion and will go down in history as a decade which solidified Fiji's economic future." That was in the budget address 2019-2020, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, sir, there was no such economic boom, as was claimed by the Honourable Minister. Had it been any semblance of boom, we would not be in a doomed situation as we are in today. Kaboom situation, you know. Mr. Speaker, sir,
Order.
this pandemic is far more serious than we currently face here in Fiji. People are dying all over the world where infections have been intense, vis-a-vis the USA, India, Brazil, Russia, and Europe. My greatest fear is for the people. God forbid any further infection in our country. Our healthcare system, as I say again, is not in a sound state to cope. Thanks to Fiji First government, misruled for the last 14 years. Mr. Speaker, sir, may I suggest to the government to urgently consider convening a national summit. That sounds like an old record, does it? We have been calling for that.
Order.
Where representatives of key stakeholders from different communities, civil society organizations can participate. We need to consult and involve the private sector in our discussion to restore their confidence and trust. We need to establish a spirit of genuine dialogue and mutual respect
Order.
for one another, rather than consultation with a selected few like-minded people. Any selective approach, Mr. Speaker, sir, will not work. At the moment, we are a bipartisan country, bipolar country. We are pointing at you. If you include us, then we are part of your plan. You're all part of the national plan to move Fiji forward. Any selective approach will not work. We need to shift away from petty politics and obscurity, which has been the hallmark of your government, Mr. Prime Minister. People must know the truth. This country needs more open democracy, government accountability and transparency. The government needs to stand up to what it preaches. Mr. Speaker, sir, I say this in the spirit of the 1997 Constitution, which is no longer in force, that guaranteed the full rights and freedom of all citizens of Fiji. I have not deviated from this principle and continue to believe and urge our people to unite for the common good of all. I sincerely believe that we could get through this unprecedented event if we all share our collective responsibility and dedicate our efforts to bequeath to our future generations a socially harmonious and prosperous nation. Against this backdrop, Mr. Speaker, sir, I share my take on the national budget 2020-2021 with all the representatives of Fiji and the nation as a whole. Mr. Speaker, sir, on many occasions, when this side of the House suggested alternatives or provided policy options to the government, we are accused of and ridiculed of being ignorant or of trying to politicize issues. A classic example, Mr. Speaker, sir, is when I discussed the subject of government finance and pertinent issues related to the economy. We always suggest alternatives based on sound advice from our local and international experts and our own research. Mr. Speaker, sir, the Minister of the Economy always pretends to be an expert of the economy and finance and often ridicules others, but fails to see the problems that exist. When we point out that our economy is facing headwinds or that our economy is in recession, the response from government has always been nasty and demeaning. The Minister of the Economy blames us, and me personally, for the problems that exist now, referring to things that happened more than 3 decades ago. Mr. Speaker, sir, it is now time that the Fiji First government take full responsibility of the things they did wrong and stop blaming others. Mr. Speaker, sir, for how long will this government keep blaming others for its own faults? It is time now that the Fiji First government realizes its own wrong policies that has left us high and dry, policies that have put the people of this country in a dire situation. The COVID-19 pandemic has only made things obvious. The Fijian economy has been facing problems from about 5 years ago. It did not start with the COVID-19 pandemic. It started in 2014 and possibly even a few years earlier than that. Mr. Speaker, sir, I know that the Honourable Minister of the Economy will continue blaming others for his short-sightedness, for he is not humble enough to admit his faults. But, Mr. Speaker, sir, the people of this country are not fools. They know what this government is doing and what it is not doing. The damage that the Fiji government has inflicted on this country through obscurity, lack of accountability, and fraudulent practices runs into billions of dollars. Yes, Mr. Speaker, sir, not millions, it is billions of dollars. Our future generations will remain heavily indebted for a long, long time to come and will judge this government in very bad taste. Mr. Speaker, sir, coming back to the budget, I term it as irresponsible, rudderless, and deceiving budget. While the budget is terribly expansionary, it provides the policymakers least direction in terms of how those expenditures are to be implemented to achieve the desired objectives. Mr. Speaker, sir, a huge amount of funds are held as RIE category, which does not provide any indication of commitments of those funds. I will deliberate on that a little later. Mr. Speaker, sir, it is mind-boggling to observe the amount of funds held under Head 50. This indicates that the government remains unsure of where it intends to commit those funds. These are some of the reasons to term this budget a rudderless budget. We have a debt-ridden economy. Mr. Speaker, sir, the national public debt has now reached epic proportions. It will bring the nations to its knees. Yes, we agree that the COVID-19 situation is different from all others, as the Honourable Minister has reiterated in his address. But, Mr. Speaker, sir, I wish to say that the country would have been far better off if the government was more diligent and accountable in the recent past. Today, our public debt level has surpassed 80% of the GDP. That is I admit they're both unprecedented. Under this budget, the expenditure to revenue ratio is ridiculously high at more than 200%. Mr. Speaker, sir, all aspects of our economic stagnation, increasing poverty, deteriorating law and order situation, dilapidated infrastructure, weak institutions, and the high debt to GDP ratio are associated with the Fiji government's bad policies, poor governance, and above all, poor expenditure and the revenue, or simply put, at the deficit status of the budget compared to the last financial year. COVID-19 response budget. And I draw your attention to the following comparison, Mr. Speaker, sir. Total estimated revenue, 1.7 billion, a decrease of 0.8 billion from 2.5 previously announced. Total estimated expenditure, 3.7 billion, an increase of 0.2 billion from 3.5 in the previous announcement. The gross deficit, 2.5 billion, increased by 1.5 billion from 1.2 before, 1.2 billion. Total loan program, 2.7 billion, increased by 1.2 billion from 1.5 before. Overseas loan, 1.4 billion, increase of 0.8 billion from the 0.6 billion announced before. And domestic loan, 1.6 billion, increased by 0.4 billion from the 0.9 billion announced in the previous one. And RIE, those that are still under requisition, will be 1.6 billion, increased from 0.2 billion, increased from the 1.4 announced before. The total estimated revenue is 1.7 billion. Total estimated expenditure is 3.7 billion. Estimated net deficit, 2 billion. Gross deficit, 2.8 billion. I reiterate what you said to one of our colleagues, a junior officer at the time, living like kings on peasants' wages. Total estimated revenue, 1.7, a decrease from 0.8 billion from the 2.5 before. Total estimated expenditure, 3.7, increase of 0.2 billion. Gross deficit, 2.8 billion, increase 1.5 billion. Total loan program, 2.7 billion, increased from 1.2 billion, increased by 1.2 from 1.5 before. Overseas loan, 1.4 billion, increased by 0.8 billion from the 0.6 billion before. Domestic loan and all those things show that things are not well. Mr. Speaker, sir, this is nothing less than a doomsday budget. Just look at the figures. To appreciate the implication of these figures and to determine the right mix of revenue and expenditure, Mr. Speaker, sir, one has to review the trend over the last 7 years, perhaps, so that a realistic budget based on reality can be developed. The average actual expenditure for the last 7 years is around 2.9 billion, Mr. Speaker, sir, and the revenue around 2.6 billion. Compared to 2021 budget revenue will drastically be reduced by 1.7 billion. It is understandable and expected. However, expenditure has increased from the average of 2.9 to 3.7 billion, an increase of 800 million, Mr. Speaker. We know only too well that based on the current expenditure trend, we do not have the capacity to spend the total amount allocated in the budget. The question is, why is the variation so substantial? Basically, revenue streams have not been realized, and second, there is always substantial under-expenditure. The expenditure in the budget is 220% the size of the projected revenue. The deficit of the budget is 120% of the revenue, and the deficit as a percentage of GDP is 20.2%. That is absolutely reckless and irresponsible. There is no such example of a budget like this in the history of not the Fiji, but the history of humanity. If this had happened in a genuine democracy, Mr. Speaker, sir, the minister would have been asked to resign immediately. Mr. Speaker, sir, these figures need the attention of everybody because this is historic. It is unprecedented. Yes, I agree that the time we are passing through is difficult and unique, and we may be doing things that have never been done before. But the fact remains that we cannot do things that put our future generations into perpetual debt. Mr. Speaker, sir, I wish to further draw your attention to the level of deficit in this budget. We, as the representatives of the people, need to know and explain. We need to analyze this, Mr. Speaker, sir. We cannot just let it pass. Mr. Speaker, sir, the gross deficit in the budget is 27.8% of GDP, which points to $750 million in annual loan repayment. That level of public debt now stands at 83% of GDP. Mr. Speaker, sir, the seriousness and the gravity of this matter can only be measured in relative terms. We know that the situation is not normal, but the fact is we cannot go overboard and do things that will hurt our people in the long run. We cannot harm our ability to develop in the future. The level of the debt will do exactly that. It will constrain our ability to borrow in the future for our development. Mr. Speaker, sir, I wish to read to you what the Honourable Minister of the Economy said in his address comparing Fiji with Singapore. And I quote, "The world are quickly recognizing that only those nations that are willing to step up and finance a recovery will avert catastrophe and emerge whole from this crisis." Terms like prudent management and debt sustainability are taking on new meanings. And he added, for example, Mr. Speaker, Singapore, a nation long renowned for its prudence, launched its fourth stimulus package in May, which pushed its budget deficit to nearly 16% of GDP. Faced with a crushing 41% economic contraction in the second quarter, Singapore knows what Fiji knows. The only thing standing between COVID-19 recession and COVID-19 depression are Herculean efforts to stimulate economies, end of quote. That was in his budget address of 2020-2021. I hear some echoes of that is true. I will let you see whether this is true in what we are doing. Mr. Speaker, sir, this is a very strange comparison. Singapore is a very different economy from ours. It is different structurally and hugely different in size and status. First, Singapore's GDP per capita is more than 10 times the per capita GDP of Fiji. As of 2019, Singapore stands at US $65,233 to Fiji's US $6,220. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, sir, Singaporean economy is 67 times as big as the Fijian economy. Singapore is $372 billion US dollars compared to Fiji's $5.5 billion. Mr. Speaker, sir, the Honourable Minister needs to be realistic when he draws comparisons between economies. This is only a little short of being amusing. Mr. Speaker, sir, Singapore is a trading hub of the Pacific. It economically conjoins the Americas with Asia. We do have a comparison. Do we have a comparison there? Even if we do choose to compare, this budget still puts us in a far worse situation than Singapore is in. Mr. Speaker, sir, Singapore, with its 41% economic decline due to COVID-19, has a budget deficit of 16%, where our deficit is 20.2%, when our economic decline is only 21.3%. Mr. Speaker, sir, if we were to compare Singapore with Fiji with some degree of rationality and logic, then our deficit should have been closer to 8% and not 20.2%. The economic decline, Mr. Speaker, sir, the government is now projecting the single largest economy would contract by 21.7% in the fiscal year 2020-2021. Already 115,000 Fijians, which are the third of our total workforce, have either lost their jobs completely or are now on reduced hours and wages. This is expected when the economy contracts at this rate, Mr. Speaker, sir. As I have mentioned earlier, the budget deficit is so massive and unsustainable. This is because the government is not able to appropriate funds through its tax policies. It is fundamentally the case because our economy lacks the productive capacity to generate the expected output. This actually is not a COVID-19 phenomenon. The contraction of the economy is also reflected by the declining revenue projections in the 2019-20 budget. The issue of declining economy was raised at the time also in the comparison to 2018-19 national budget, Mr. Speaker, sir. The people of Fiji have been deceived by the Fiji government, the Fiji First government, Mr. Prime Minister, in the last few years by the manipulation of budget figures. It is unfortunate that the truth about the economy is only now coming out. Mr. Speaker, sir, the Minister is bold enough, without shame, to continue to say that the Fiji economy has grown in a steady rate of above 3% on average over the past 10 years. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, sir, the truth is, if you compare the real growth rate by a decade since 1970, this is how it stands. 71 to 80, 4.85%. 81 to 90, 2.46%. 91 to 2000, 2.44%. 2001 to 2010, 1.36%. And 2011 to 2020, 0.75%. It is so sad that the Minister continues to misinform the people. He is selectively using periods perhaps to choose his own data and agenda. Where is the unprecedented growth when real growth for the 2011 to 2020 period is only around 0.75% and much lower than the previous decade? Mr. Speaker, sir, we all know that the economy was already in recession from a long time back, and even, especially in the last 4 years. The fact is that despite the economy in recession, the government continued to be bullish, and we've used that word before, on expenditure and refused to consolidate government finances. Today, Mr. Speaker, sir, we see the dire consequences of the government's budgetary follies. Mr. Speaker, sir, this side of the House, and I have the confidence of the Honorable Mr. Biman Prasad to say this, we have been raising this issue in the last 4 years, that the economy is in recession. This advice has been totally ignored and have fallen on deaf ears. The truth and the reality, Mr. Speaker, sir, becomes obvious now. It becomes obvious when the COVID-19 response budget was presented to Parliament in April this year. Mr. Speaker, sir, it is already known in public through the social media that the Honourable Minister of the Economy has been manipulating and inflating the revenue figures to exaggerate economic growth. In a nutshell, the manipulation of the budget figures in the last couple of years, particularly inflating the revenue figures to intentionally reduce government deficit, is a cardinal sin and unacceptable. If you did that and you're trying to borrow money from the bank, you would be charged and taken to court. We are lying to the people. Prior to COVID-19 budget, the revenue shortfall was already hovering at about $1.5 billion. Mr. Speaker, sir, this is debauchery of the highest order. This should not be tolerated. Any credible Prime Minister of a credible democratic government will not tolerate such behavior from his Minister for the Economy. The Prime Minister should seriously consider reallocating that ministry to somebody more capable. Or you take it on, Prime Minister. That is your responsibility, looking after the economy of the nation. Mr. Speaker, sir, the people of Fiji should know the truth. We should not solely blame COVID-19 pandemic as an act of God, as claimed by the Minister of the Economy. The Fiji First government has always put blame on others, even on God, for things they have done wrong. The Fiji First leaders have been in power for the last 13 years and have committed many unethical practices. Mr. Speaker, sir, it is time to stop blaming others. It's time for you to take responsibility and must know that the people of Fiji are watching. If you do not act with honor and grace now, history will judge you harshly. The growth forecast, Mr. Speaker, sir. It's interesting to note the growth forecast of 14% by the Reserve Bank of Fiji for the next financial year, and that is overstated and unrealistic. It is very clear that the independence of the Reserve Bank of Fiji has been compromised through interference from the Minister of the Economy. These figures are all over the place, particularly in independent institutions. Based on the June release on performance of key sectors of the economy, all the sectors show a negative figure, hovering around minus 30.4%. Electricity, minus 7.4%. Cement, minus 28.7%. Gold, minus 7.6%. Pine wood, minus 23.9%, Mr. Speaker. Sawn timber, minus 50.8%. Wood chip, minus 11.5%. Visitors arrival, minus 56.2%. Lending for consumption, minus 20.2%. Net VAT collection, minus 30.1%. New registration for VAT, minus 45.3%. Sales of vehicles second-hand, minus 65.5%. Domestic cement sale, minus 18.8%. New lending for buildings and construction, minus 28.7%. Mr. Speaker, sir, we really need a miracle to achieve the growth forecast figure given to us by our Reserve Bank of Fiji. It takes time for these sectors to rebound. While some may take a shorter lag period, Some will take longer. This is another clear indication of the cooking and manipulation of information, which is clearly evident in the budget figures presented by the Honourable Minister for the Economy. Import duties and import and domestic industries. The Speaker, sir, the statement made by the Minister for the Economy to justify the changes in tariff is absurd and short-sighted, and he is still trying to put the blame on somebody else. We should stop the blame game and take full responsibility. And I say this when he said, and I quote, Fiji's overly complicated customs system has put too much discretionary powers in the hands of customs officers. And I don't know whether the Honourable Prime Minister will agree with that statement, which leads inevitably to inconsistency, uncertainty, and corruption. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do.
I'm sure many importers have found themselves at the mercy of customs officers, imbued with subjective and corruptible power to decide which vaguely defined duty their goods will attract. It's not a system suited to an efficient economy, and we are scrapping it. How many times customs officers have been prosecuted? How many have been convicted? You sound like a very inefficient leader or commander blaming your troops, or a worker blaming his tools. Mr. Speaker, sir, there is no doubt that we are facing unprecedented challenges in the backdrop of the government claim of unprecedented growth, Bainimarama boom, and so on in the past. Mr. Speaker, sir, it is absolutely tragic that our country is not just in a recession, but in deep crisis. A crisis that is reminiscent of the Great Depression, and it is a global one. However, the solutions to our problems cannot be borrowed from elsewhere. Our problems are unique, and no other country can offer us unconditional assistance, not even a conditional one, as all countries are affected and are in similar crises. Mr. Speaker, sir, apart from providing livelihood to our citizens, we must also ensure that our industries remain viable. The current crisis requires us to be diligent in how we tread our economic path from here forward. We're not even sure how the world trade will continue in the future, and how it will re-establish its function to promote global trade, just as US and China conflict escalates. Mr. Speaker, sir, common sense dictates that we take care of our domestic economy in the midst of COVID-19 crisis. The removal or reduction of tariffs from more than 1,600 items in the 2020-21 national budget is worrying and uncalled for, to say the least. Such reductions or removal of tariffs is often done with great care and consideration of its effect on local industries. The Honourable Prime Minister, as a former customs officer, should know better about the implications of such actions to the nation in terms of its impact on our trading relationship, investment, and the survival of our small manufacturing sectors. Mr. Speaker, sir, we cannot and should not slash tariffs at will and unilaterally. We must consider implications to our local environment in terms of employment, investment, and capacity for our local market, among others. Mr. Speaker, sir, tariff is not all about raising revenue or just giving immediate relief to people. It is about creating a balance to ensure that we take advantage of our comparative and competitive advantages. I would like to reiterate my concern about this tariff removal in the budget. I request the Minister of the Economy to relook at that aspect of the budget so that it does not have a debilitating effect on the economy in any way. My understanding is that tariff can be divided into three broad categories, which include consumables, capital equipment for investment, and raw material. By reducing tariff on consumables, we are opening our doors to be flooded with cheap products from abroad which may sometimes be called dumping, particularly from areas and countries that do not have enforceable or good labor relations laws. We also know that 90% of our materials are imported. This will kill or destroy our limited manufacturing sector and further increase unemployment. Rather than playing around with our tariffs, we should pay more attention on facilitating trade and providing the enabling environment for investment. The expenditures in the budget, even those directed at SMEs to provide employment, are not clear. We can easily do this by removing costly bureaucratic processes in clearing goods, improving the infrastructure, and by pricing the utilities to reduce costs. Most of these are under our control. While other countries are moving towards a single window processes to facilitate trade, we have stayed behind. Fiji is moving backwards with all unnecessary requirements put into place by the Fiji First government. This is clearly reflected in our global ranking for ease of doing business, which has worsened terribly from 43rd in 2008 to 130th in 2019. We must recognize that the nations are moving into trading blocs to reap economic advantage rather than just opening up. We need to recognize that we are part of the Pacific and in the midst of small island developing countries. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, sir, we must be mindful of how Fiji fits into different trading blocs. The tariff structure is an important consideration and prerequisite in order to be part of various trading blocs. It is time to seriously consider joining the PACER Plus arrangement rather than being selective. Trying to punch above your weight is not our way to go because trading arrangements are made on a reciprocal basis. Therefore, we should rethink our trade policies and resume talks with our traditional partners in the Pacific. Going a little back into history, Mr. Speaker, sir, when I was Prime Minister, I was always reminded by the then Minister of Finance and the Central Planning Office that we must always be cautious and not be bullish on government finances due to our vulnerability to international trading, environment, and natural disasters. The question, Mr. Speaker, sir, is where are the independence and integrity of those institutions in providing government sound policy advice? Mr. Speaker, sir, the independence and integrity of key institutions, Finance, Planning Office, RBF, FRCS, have been compromised or marginalized so that the Minister of the Economy has a free hand by removing the checks and balances that have been in place to ensure transparency and accountability. We need an inquiry into this. If we are worthy to be called a democracy, not to prosecute anyone, but to smoothen up and make it more efficient, our system. We need independent commissions to find out whether our institutions are alive and whether they are allowed to perform the functions for which they were designed and which they are expected to perform. One wonders whether Fiji has had any degree of preparedness to cushion the impact of COVID-19 pandemic and tropical cyclone Harold. I ask this because after reviewing the ADB report on the comparative analysis growth forecast in the Pacific in June of 2020, it is interesting to note that countries with much higher vulnerability index or indices are able to cushion the crisis better than Fiji, which is considered a much more vibrant nation in the Pacific. Based on that, ADB's preliminary assessment at the end of June 2020, Fiji's economy will contract by more than 15%. But it's well known that our economy now will contract by at least 21.7%. I say at least 21.7%, Mr. Speaker, sir, because the real fallout of the crisis is still to come. Mr. Speaker, sir, while Papua New Guinea's output is expected to contract by 1.5%, Tonga 3%, Samoa 5%, and Vanuatu 9.9%, Fiji is doomed to contract by much more, now estimated at 21.7%. Mr. Speaker, sir, that needs an explanation. Mr. Speaker, sir, they must have done something right, those countries. We must have done something not so right. One explanation could be that the government cooked economic figures to hide the true status of the economy. Thus, our fiscal space deteriorated, leaving the government in a terribly weaker position to consider strong corrective actions. And now the unsustainable deficit and humongous debt on the backs of a future generation is diminishing the country's ability to consider fiscal policy options to address contingencies in the near future. Foreign Affairs, Mr. Speaker, sir, I'm very much concerned with the decision taken by government to unilaterally close down 5 of our embassies, particularly those in the United States, Papua New Guinea, and Malaysia. Papua New Guinea was the first government to recognize the post-1987 administration in Fiji. And last week they had their Remembrance Day, public holiday, to honor the thousands of Papua New Guinean natives who fought alongside Allied forces in the war against the Japanese in World War II. They helped in slowing down the Japanese advance into the Pacific and prevented them from further conquest and occupation of the Melanesian West. Papua New Guinea sponsored Fiji's entry into the Melanesian Spearhead Group during my term as Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, sir, and Papua New Guinea has been a loyal and faithful partner in the bloc negotiations during the WTO GATT and ACP EU trade talks, particularly in the early 1990s when I was Prime Minister. Firstly, while I, and I'm sure this government recognizes that it is their sovereign choice, or our sovereign choice of a country to do that, however, as a courtesy, perhaps a phone call from our Prime Minister to the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, or perhaps a briefing with our High Commissioner, Tigoi Tonga, would have eased the situation. This act alone, as it happened, would be regarded as a diplomatic faux pas, and you understand that, Mr. Speaker, sir, better than most of us, or diplomatic affront. Secondly, permanent closure would imply a serious diplomatic incident, or that a breach may have occurred, like a situation of war, which would lead to such an announcement through a budget statement. In PNG's experience with Singapore, following their unilateral decision to close their High Commission there in the late 1990s because of cost, which is our reason now, they found it extremely difficult to reopen their embassy or their High Commission in the year 2000. Fiji may encounter similar difficulties in the future if a new Fiji government decides to reopen the 5 missions that will be closed. Finally, this closure, as a consequence, may have implications for Fiji's membership of the MSG. PNG may consider that in spite of having a very close relationship through MSG, Jakarta and Abu Dhabi are considered by Fiji to be more important than Port Moresby. The United States has always been a part of Fiji's history in peace and in war. In the current climate of Sino-USA relations, what picture are we painting with the closing of the Fiji embassy in the USA and leaving open the Fiji embassy in Beijing? Fiji, as part of the British Commonwealth forces, was instrumental in defeating Chinese communist terrorists in Malaya before it formed the Federation and became Malaysia in 1963. Fiji participated in that war from 1952 to 1956 and lost 12 soldiers killed in action. Your late Ratu, Mr. Speaker, sir, the Deputy Prime Minister, Colonel Ratu Sir Edward Tubnavo Zakamba was one of the commanding officers of that battalion that participated there. In view of these historic associations, Mr. Speaker, sir, I believe the government should reconsider this decision. Take into account the historical background regarding our relationship with those countries. Our relationships with these countries were based on strong economic and geopolitical rationale. It's also very important that we continue to foster and build stronger relationships with those countries, particularly at this time in history when we are facing crisis and global geopolitics in taking an unusual turn, shape, and dimension. I did not mention that you also participated in Borneo after independence, also in the actions against terrorists at that time. Sectoral, Mr. Speaker, sir, yes. Sectoral expenditure, Mr. Speaker, sir, there are many expenditure allocations that are troubling and need the attention of Parliament. I've already mentioned the dilapidated condition of our healthcare system and the likely inability to handle any serious pandemic situation or the worsening of the current one. Mr. Speaker, sir, the allocation for the education sector has been reduced by $20 million this fiscal year, when in fact this one sector where lots of intense involvement of teachers is needed due to remote and flexible teaching. Mr. Speaker, sir, this is nearly $40 million decline since the 2018-2019 budget. This reduction begs this question, whether it is an indication of the declining importance of education in our country, or is that earlier allocations were wasteful and has been largely the case of previous years. Well, Mr. Speaker, sir, this has been the hallmark of the Fiji First government since it came into power. The education sector should have increased drastically in this situation to reflect more support for activities to cater for new learning and teaching programs like distance and flexible learning. Tourism, Mr. Speaker, sir, this sector is a sector that has brought down our economy substantially, or it costs. I know very little can be done about that. It relies so much on a healthy world environment. But I would have expected the government to take significant measures to generate domestic tourism. Looking to turn Tasman or Pacific bubble to be extended to Fiji may be too optimistic. Even the projection of 60% to 66% recovery for 2021 and 2022 respectively may be over-optimistic. Mr. Speaker, sir, the government wishful thinking that early recovery of the economy is least likely to grow by 41.1% in 2021 as projected in the supplement to the budget. The IMF and ADB projections are much lower than projected by the government. So what I see here is the Honourable Minister is again not observing any restraint on or consulting the right people and institutions about economic issues affecting us. These government projections, Mr. Speaker, sir, are shots in the dark to hoodwink the people. It is again the case of bad habits die hard for the Honourable Minister for the Economy. Mr. Speaker, sir, these primary sectors, agriculture, fisheries and forest, they offer great hope for the economy and for the country. These sectors need special attention of the government so that our SMEs can engage in those sectors to create new industries that would employ our people. We need special development strategies to realize SME success in those sectors. Lots of targeted programs can be put in place that can become successful if right ideas are implemented with government assistance. Such industries could become self-sustaining since they are sources of raw material and sourced from raw material. Mr. Speaker, sir, manufacturing. Lots of targeted policy are needed in manufacturing to support that sector. This sector generates a lot of jobs. If merchandise exports can be maintained, this sector can prove to be of great advantage in terms of creating and sustaining better paid jobs. Areas of possible reduction are diverted to other priority sectors of the economy, Mr. Speaker, sir. Some of the specific allocations that I feel are unnecessary to be removed to reduce gross deficit or redirected to key sectors of the economy are construction of new Prime Minister's office, 7 million. Leasing of government vehicles, 29 million. Increase in government grant, 27.3 million. Construction of new police station, 40 million. Charge of the public debt, $1.2 billion. Mr. Speaker, sir, do we really need to construct a new office for the Prime Minister when there are people in the country going hungry? No. Is the timing right? I believe the timing is not right. Is there any urgency for a new office for the Prime Minister? The allocation for government vehicles continues to increase, now at $29 million. It is time we streamline this expenditure. There are better ways to improve efficiency through pooling arrangements, particularly at this time. It is surprising that the rent for office space under Head 50 has increased by 7.2 million from 27.3 million to 34.5 million. Government has frozen increases in rent, but it continues to pay the rich landlords through this increase. Mr. Speaker, sir, do we really need the construction of the new police station valued at $14 million? No. It is time to consolidate and work with the community and focus on improving existing infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, sir, it is worth noting that $1.2 billion has been allocated under Head 52 for payment of public debts, principal and interest. The government should focus its efforts on discussing with our lenders and financiers for possible debt review and moratorium, rather than wasting time on trans-Tasman and Bulla Bubble, knowing too well that the borders will remain closed for some time yet. We would at least divert $700 million, between $700 and $800 million, to priority areas to help those that have lost their jobs through work for cash programs, which has been used extensively when unemployment increases in other countries. In addition, Mr. Speaker, sir, what a whopping $1.6 billion is under requisition to incur expenditure, RIE. This is a clear indication that one man is controlling all the funds and not the responsible agencies.
Order, 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 order.
It is a sign of poor planning. That documentation for expenditures are not ready. It is a worst-case scenario. It is a sign that funds may only be released if money is available. It is a sign of desperation to make the budget look good. But the reality, Mr. Speaker, sir, is that most of these funds will not be realized or used at all. In program budgeting, there is no such thing as saving, because everything should be well programmed for implementation. The removal of the PSIP program gives free hand for control only to one minister. We could easily reduce our budget by at least $700 million, Mr. Speaker, sir, to reduce our deficit and the consequent borrowing, or better still, reallocate this amount to priority sectors that will provide employment opportunities and minimize risks of hardship to those who have lost their means of livelihood. Mr. Speaker, sir, after reviewing and analyzing the budget in detail, the most important issues that keep creeping into my mind is how this budget will help ordinary people that are suffering from the crisis and how it could be balanced. This budget reminds me of a quote from a famous writer and political observer, Arthur Leffer, when he said, while talking about prosperity for all, and I quote, "Government spending is taxation. When you look at it this way, I have never heard of a poor person spending himself to prosperity. Let alone, I've never heard of a poor person taxing himself to prosperity." End of quote.
You said great budget? No, you said no.
Order.
Mr. Speaker, sir, the biggest challenge facing our nation today is not global warming or COVID-19 pandemic. It is out of control, unbridled government spending. To me, Mr. Speaker, sir, it is quite clear that the government has wasted a lot of funds through inefficiency, misuse of funds, and sloth. We should be realistic and compare ourselves with similar countries and not Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand. Trying to punch above our weight is not the way forward. At this point in time, we should focus on our own internal comparative and competitive advantages before venturing out. However, we must try and maintain our bilateral and multilateral arrangements rather than trying to work it alone. Our expenditure must be well targeted to priority areas that will surely help our people, particularly the most vulnerable, rather than supporting big entities who have been exempted and are paid high rent despite the freeze. Food security and the protection and well-being of our people should be paramount, rather than the big businesses who are already rich and have a reserve to cushion them from the impact of the crisis. Mr. Speaker, sir, let us prioritize the human side of everything, keeping in mind the future of our citizens. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir. God bless PG.